Aftershocks felt till next year. Tin cans that once stored gunpowder bleached to milk. Rather than plastic horns, he'd hear colic cries. In a place where chaste clouds come down to sip spittle from their upper lips, he tried to overhear the violence kilometers away. Instead of feasting, they slept on a banig on the floor, wide enough for no god to slip in, his son holding his finger like a hammer that could only build, never destroy, and he believed this, as a homeless male snuck in to sing carols in his cochlea. Then he could no longer hear his fighting cocks hiss as he yields the illegal chili from its cloaca, or his wife suck out shrimp paste left beneath her nails, or his boys thumbing through the QWERTY alphabet of a blushing Nokia. Only the serenade of packing tape stretched over chapped brown lips of cardboard boxes, and sputter of a motorcycle smoke belching the playa shut. As speechless as he is in a desert where he is beautiful silent, only a forehead kneeling like a banana's male bud about to bear fruit could earn water that lose way too fast in their throats. Here, the chapel stew is dry, and shoeboxes with desiccants intact are enough to soar for a stunted word mid-sky. Even if they could only swear of women whose niqab he allegedly lifted, or her tongue that may have revered another's reverie, or the firecracker their son set off too early, it left him soundless. In the silence of other men in puberty, he feels a shiver of consent in his back pocket. Suddenly, all else is daybreak. Noli Me Tangere, John 20:17, page 12. In a rural mass, a deaf woman sitting on a pew answers the catechism with babbles. Vowels expand, rounding with air, but does not sever from her throat. No matter how deep the wind fists, her drums won't sound. How the tongue could only touch as much as it has touched, her sins extraterrestrial. On a faded banig, a blind man makes love with what feels like a sister after 12 years of loving a wife. By their bedside, a harem of black ants removes the raised limbs of a fly in the greatest act of falling apart. He whispers, "You're beautiful," in her ear, and she cannot hear but believes. She cannot hear the father who touches her forehead, drawing a black cross, then taking that sacrifice to his lips as he kisses her like a child. She professes her love, yet he hears, "Amen," and all is forgiven. Her fist clenching a rosary, ash of palms burying in her neck, while he, like a child, bit and bit, amen and amen. She professed her love, and he believes. There are no creatures as forever's color, no animal as colorless than her. Even when she made love with another, there is a place, darker than this that the light hasn't reached. Why stand blocking, taking in every stray Fahrenheit, when they can lay untouched side by side? The Ocean Scavenger, page 14. On nights when the moon has fully emptied out itself, he would watch the waltz of gnat and lizard on the ceiling, a distant sound of froth muffling their tongues. When the cricket's legs have stilled and tangled along with another, an amputee with equally broken music, he would pull himself up from the mat of woven leaves, feeling each bone grind against cartilage, and his cartilage moans muscle, and nerve tickles his tender swollen mosquito bites, and he takes out his makeshift gas lamp from an old cupboard, twisting the rubber plug free, refilling the oil. He pulls a small metal latch and a fire ignites, sputtering as he fiddled with the gas knob till he is satisfied with the intensity. The lizard's shadow on the wall flickers, as if tiny palms were pushing against its belly. He straps it and a small knife on his hip holster and descends from his stilted shack, the low tide lapping at his rubber slippers, sand coaxing it into its crushed bed, forcing him to remove their wet grip and fling them out like freed crows, stripping into flies, into night. Pumping more fuel into his lamp, he begins his trek, feet wade knowingly through the seaweeds, shy cartographer flesh meets ocean flesh. He would reach out for edibles, tossing them into the pail, clumps of seaweed, cone snails, black and white sea cucumbers that he would dismember first. Stooping close, his hand brushes beneath a bleached table coral and carefully picks up a sea urchin, his flame illuminating its dancing violet spines. Turning it over, he presses on the circular lining of its mouth with his thumbs, cracking it open, pouring out the violet liquid. He scrapes off the orange sex sacs with a finger, raising them to his lips, slipped inside for tasting. From afar, he sees some antlered body ascend, bursting over the surface before shattering. The pang of salt desserts without leaving claw marks in his throat, catarrh parching his mouth. How long since his gas ran out?
Okay, this guy is serially. But fellows first.
Thank you. Start. In a general workshop, we have many genres. If it's poetry that's being discussed, we normally ask the fellow poets to speak. But everyone in here is a poet, so so I think you have no choice. You have to say something. But we'll do it on a volunteer basis. So the one who's most prepared to say something in the beginning can start, and then the others will follow. Okay. I think Tom, who has so many notes on his manuscript on his kit, will start. You're also the roommate, right?
Yes.
So we begin, so you can clobber him later in his sleep.
Wala siya mamaya. I have a lot of notes here, specifically just because I was trying to figure my way through the poems. Because I find that there's for each one.
Is that a significant experience for you? The figuring it out? Yes. Can you elaborate?
Well, I found it difficult reading, going through all the poems. Not necessarily because there was something wrong, but because, like, particularly on the first poem, for example, a lot of images were presented. They became really rich and layered. So, with my reading of the first poem, I found like my reading of it came from a very global reading. It felt very global, and then at the same time it leads back to the Philippines. With the second poem, it was more sensual and then logical. Like we got to experience what it means to be to have sense and then lose it. The same reading. On the third, I actually read it more for its movement and how it would play out, starting from the bed, starting from the moon all the way out to the ocean. Right now, I don't really have much
Just
to say.
confine yourself to just those 3 poems that were read, because it's a whole suite that Mariel gave us. And the same with all of you. While we're going to just hear 3 poems read out loud, the commentary can be on the whole collection.
Well, generally, reading through the whole collection,
Yes.
I was really interested with the images because they were very thick through all the poems. Again, going back to layer. So I actually had to keep reading just so I could try understanding it. And generally,
But there is difficulty in understanding, because the procession of imagery in any poem need not create that sort of difficulty. But there is difficulty. Can you put your finger on it?
My difficulty with it personally was, I think I already know what's going to happen with a certain image or 2 images, and then with the next image, while it tries to do something else. like keeps going back, and generally, so I have to keep going back and do a new reading to see how it fits in with the previous images.
So there's no, there's unity, there is some situation that sort of makes everything cohere supposedly, but there's an associativeness to the imagery that's not necessarily logical or easy to follow.
I'd say it's probably logical, but I'm still trying to find the logic while reading through it. And I'm still trying to put things together while I wait.
Oh my god, this is Q&A. I'm sorry. Trying to sort of tease more from Tom here. Yes, so we can actually focus more closely on the text to see the nature of the difficulty. The poem that Mariel did not read, which I find actually the most interesting one, is the very first one. And, oh, ganito na, no? Guided na, no, ng konti, you know? First of all, you have a poem called Playing Passover. Passover is such a pregnant signifier. It is not just a normal word. It brings with it a history and a myth, actually, of the redemption of the Israelites. And of course, through Christianity, we have inherited it. It's part of salvation history. It's supposed to be a prefigurement of the coming of Christ himself, you know, the Lamb of God who is, in fact, the one sacrificed, no? There is blood here, there is bloodletting here, there is some sacrificial element here. But then, it's such a pregnant signifier that you really cannot just shake it off and sort of immediately sort of lend yourself to the revision of it that the poem is offering. Because it seems to be not interested in Moses and the Egyptians and all of that. It's just using the word Passover and looking at what might be appropriated of that from that sort of image. And that's, I think, the clue. There is a surface sort of aesthetics here that actually is working more on the level of pun and metonymy rather than metaphor and depth. In fact, you see it happening clearly. Once an image starts, then the next image is actually just a pun, sort of has an associative and superficial relationship to it, rather than a deep one. Okay, so let's begin. While boys pluck runts off the litter for roasting, some holding on, stretching their mother's dry teeth. So selfish, we go to scrape mothers of pearl from the slack jaws of mussels. Okay, so suddenly you have mother's dry teeth. So there is an animal with a litter of puppies or you know, young offspring, and then there's the we. Those are the boys. The we then is now not a boy. That's clearly what's being said. Okay, the we meaning the girls do something else. They scrape mothers of pearl from the slack jaws of mussels. The mother in the beginning, and now the mother of pearl. You understand that? That is the relationship, which is not actually a deep one. There is no metaphorical relationship there. Well, okay, sorry. It's not like, parang siyang boxing, ano? Round one! It is not a deep relationship. It does not really build organically from that first image. It's because it sounds the same. Mother of pearl. Okay? And then it happens again. Maybe not there. Okay, so you have a polar bear image. Beached on the shore, a polar bear with leftover fur of froth melt on salt. Actually, the problem, Mariel, I can say it now, is that there is such richness in the language and such a density in it that I think maybe in writing it, you sort of lapse grammatically too often, and that's the problem. The sense of authority is lost. Diba? When you lend yourself over to a poem that's difficult, you expect you are lending yourself over, giving yourself over to someone with authority. But then with those lapses, the authority shatters. Wow, come on. This is difficult poetry and I'm ungrammatical. So you understand the ungrammatical element there? It's everywhere. Normally it's on the tense level of the verbal system. When you start, for example, in the Ocean Scavenger, it's habitual past action. On nights when the moon had fully emptied itself, he would watch the waltz. Meaning it happened in the past and it happened again and again. So it's habitual, would do it. And then nagpe-present tense ka na, somewhere down the line, so parang nasisira siya. Okay? But anyway, going back to that, that sort of surface association. So the polar bear, okay, I'm afraid we sip out the last glacier hidden in her maw. So polar bear, glacier. You understand that? Not anything deep, really, but it's just because polar bears are no association on. So ice caps, glacier, diba? Do you understand? That's what's happening in many of the lines. Nothing is being deepened in a consistent fashion. That's why we are lost, right? Because it happens too often. That's a wonderful thing to happen. And it's probably queer aesthetics. You have to research camp and the idea of surface, which sort of LGBTQ artists all over the world have sort of prioritized over depth, right? But then there is something else, like a kind of an exchange for that, right? Like when Oscar Wilde evacuated his aesthetics of depth, he actually was offering a critique which was consistent from beginning to end of his work. So there is something being said, there's a philosophical position that these artists adopted. And I'm afraid I don't see it here because it's just a suite with so few poems, right? So there is really no aesthetics yet to bind it together. But, I took over. Okay. I like this poem best of all because of the word playing. This surface sort of preference for the association happening only on the metonymic punning sort of like surface level is very much what playfulness is. And I like the fact, guys, I'm sorry, we did not specify any thematic requirement for the submission. So that's wonderful because we understand immediately that LGBTQ writing, LGBTQ poetry cannot be essentialized. That it's not a matter of topic or subject matter, it's a matter of perspective. And I'm interested therefore in how this collection, which is not thematically LGBTQ, Mariel, you talk about many different issues here. With the image of the backstrap loom, I'm thinking this is probably Lumad women, Lumad girls who are actually still weaving. Very Mindanao image in the end, no? Which I want sana for you to rethink because you can root the poem more deeply in that Mindanao Lumad context. Okay, you have then with the Kundiman poem, you have an overseas Filipino worker who's in Riyadh and then has this stream of consciousness moment and remembers his own hometown and his own sort of like pagtutuli or circumcision and that what happened in his hometown and all the women there, and then when we get to the present, something potentially queer, because it happens a lot of OFW men in the Middle East who don't really have facial hair, they become suddenly feminized, and some of them. So is that what the back pocket, the shiver of consent in the back pocket? I'm not sure. I was wondering if that's where it's gonna go. But anyway, so OFW siya. So the first one seems to be about children trying to escape their circumstances and imagining something fantastic, okay? The second one is the OFW, okay? The third one is a series of little sort of like lyric meditation on deafness in the beginning and then in the end vision. And the deafness, and there's violence here all the time between a priest and a woman and the husband, okay? And then in the end, back to the woman and the husband and that sort of absolute lack of sort of communication between them or something like that. So the theme seems to be suffering in general, injustice in general, nothing specifically LGBTQ yet. So I'm thinking the suggestion is actually probably if you're interested in an LGBTQ perspective rather than talking about the theme, maybe just one in the collection that you're thinking of, Mariel, that will actually be about suffering of the LGBTQ person. Which of course, you know a lot about. You founded an organization to address or to seek redress of grievance and on campus, precisely for that suffering. All right. So another thing to think about, Mariel, is that there is too much maybe criticism here because the injustice is actually, or the suffering is the theme. No really joyful moment yet or celebratory moment yet. There is a feminist undercurrent in the collection because there are women occurring throughout. hunter-gatherer invents clothing is actually very interesting. It's a rethinking in mythological terms of the sort of the ironic establishment of gender differentiation through clothes. You think about it, what could be a better way to differentiate people than if people were naked? Because easily you see the difference. It's actually the clothing that made the differentiation even worse. Okay, so it's interesting, but still generally criticism rather than affirmation. And if you study the feminist movement, feminist writing, there is what is called feminist critique. There is, on the other hand, gynocritics. The gynocritics is a sort of canon-making affirmative moment. The critique is like taking down patriarchal stereotypes and things like that, which the collection tries to do. So maybe another direction that Mariel can pursue, if she's interested in doing more feminist sort of imaginings, is to actually take it to that level, of writing. Defense is interesting because of the legalese that it has. The context is, of course, courtroom in a way. It's a defense. It tells an interesting story of a father killing his brother because the uncle had raped the daughter, and it's a story, Mariel, that's not. It's interesting. It's probably the first impulse we all have if we're LGBTQ, is that I am marginal. I can talk about the oppression of other LGBTQs and not really mind my own experience. But we should take heed and be very careful in a way, because we should not benefit from the suffering of other people. In other words, it's ethics, isn't it? I mean, our responsibility to others, and how probably let's just talk about our suffering first. You are using the stories of other people who have suffered, like the poor OFW, the poor Lumad children, the poor wife, and here the poor girl who was raped by her uncle. It could be a more confessional sort of, at least in the collection, there could be the more confessional sort of poems that are actually talking about your own suffering, right? Confessionalism, as wonderfully explained by Ronald, is actually the art of seeming authentic. The crucial word is seeming, right? It is, in fact, a matter of flagging the right conventions to give the impression to your reader that this is real and that it happened to you, right? So what are the elements of confessional writing? Stylistically, you cannot really have good confessional writing that is in the form of, that is in close form. Kailangan free verse siya. Kasi free verse can, in fact, mimic emotion better than, let's say, a sonnet with its iambic pentameter. It's too phony and too artificial. It cannot be authentic, okay? So it's called playing it rough. If you know how to play the guitar, it's like strumming, playing it rough. That is the confessional mode, not classical guitar playing. You understand? And then, of course, the consistent use of the eye, which is, of course, a fabrication on the page. The reason why anything we write will never coincide with us is that this is Jacques Lacan, right? The subject is split at the moment the subject speaks. The moment you turn into a subject, meaning that I in a sentence, that is the subject, right? In the grammatical sense. You create a split between the spoken about, the I on the page, the I in that utterance, and you. You are not that. Why can't you be that? Because there's something that you can do that that thing in that poem you wrote can never do, and that is change. I have to tell you, when I wrote about my dad a lot when I was younger, because he was a drunkard, and I hated him, I wrote so many poems about him, and then they were all in my first book. And then I was stupid enough to leave a copy of the book in the living room, and he had retired and was all in the house all the time. And so I arrived one evening, and he was waiting up for me. He was still awake and waiting up for me, and then said, "I read your book." Of course, immediately I said, "He couldn't have understood it, right?" But there was really, the poems are titled Father Drinking. 1 to 10. And he was also a Kapampangan and he cooked really well. So, father cooking, 1 to 10. And I was in my silver plat mode. I had a poem that ended with, Daddy, Daddy, you drunkard, I'm full. He had finished cooking, but also had gotten drunk in the process because he liked cooking and drinking at the same time. So at the end of it, I was so full of his drinking. I was so full of him that I didn't want to eat what he had cooked. That never happened. I always ate it because he was young. But anyway, he just told me that he read it. And I realized at that point, I was at least 5 years older than the persona speaking. That wasn't me anymore, and I loved my dad. At that moment, I was all tenderness and gentleness for my father. And I was no longer the I in my poems. See? You will never coincide with the I in your work. That's why probably the only way to coincide with your work is to actually embody it in the moment through live art. That's the only way. The moment it's on the page, it can ossify and you move on ahead. But it's unfolding in the moment that is when you create the I alongside yourself. No? That's probably the only way. Alas, I am not a performer. Okay, so Mariel, we can speak more, I think, in more detailed fashion about certain poems. But in general, I feel that the theme is solid naman. You understand, you want to talk about suffering and injustice. You have a cast of characters that you draw from, I suppose, the news and from experience and from your own experience, no? But I would like, because it's an LGBTQ perspective that you want to champion rather than the LGBTQ topic, I want perspective to be clarified further by including in this perspective collection and thinking poems that are actually specifically about your own experience as LGBTQ, which are not yet here in the collection. And you are very weirdly LGBTQ, according to your cover letter, you identify. May I say it? The way you identify? It's something in your organization that you already say. Non-binary. What did you say? Gender fluid and bisexual. Okay, so it's not garden variety. It's a little margin in the margin. That needs, I think, to be given airtime, right? In a collection. Alright, so now the others. Ronald.
Okay, just very briefly. When I first read this, I was very impressed. You know why? Because this is the kind of poetry that is brave. You know? I like poems that are not typical, are not predictable. This is quite challenging to read. There's something about it there. It's kind of full of fragments and associations. So hindi siya yung regular or traditional kind of poem, almost modernist of some sort, in a weird kind of sense. Right? I like it for its music. The poet is conscious and is playing with the sound, of poetry. For instance, yung hush bellows in our below, mga ganyan. So, alam mo, meron siya, she's conscious of how words can actually achieve euphony. Number one. Number two, I like it because unlike other young writers, this one is playing with form. So you have versets, you have vignettes, couplets. Maganda yung merong may dexterity and may attempt to explore so many forms. Okay, now, last, okay, I noticed that there are stories, right? But I did not find a specifically LGBT story. I think similar to Dr. Garcia, I, as a reader, would want that a bit foregrounded, because if there are stories, there are so many stories that have been, that appear here, although in snippets. Why can't they be more LGBT in orientation, or LGBTQ of some sort, right? Parang gano'n, i-foreground natin. Kasi, dahil lagi, puro kwento, puro husband and wife, or lagyan ka na ibang kwento. Dagdagan natin, layer natin pa. kwento. Particularly if the writer, is an avowed LGBTQ, wherever she may belong there, no? And then, yun, bisexual, diba? Maganda siguro na-explore natin yun. Pero gusto ko yung the language, no? Of course, may mga lapses na kailangan ayusin kasi nakakasira yun, no? Pero, yung may ambition eh. Diba? That's what I want in a young writer. Diba? Sana nung bata ko, ganyan din ako. Hindi na ako naging queen, baka empress na ako. Diba? You get me? So congratulations, Mariel.
I failed to say that, no, Mariel. Actually, it's like Ronald. This easily stood out for me when I was reading the submissions because precisely on those qualities, there is energy in the language. There is recklessness. There is rhapsody. The things that you wouldn't really sort of expect in a very young writer, actually. This is someone whose imagination is global, as Tom said. And immediately I thought what might be queer about it is actually the idea of escape. That, at least with the first poem playing Passover, I'm thinking with the last image there of the backstroke bloom and how this could possibly, we could possibly be Luman girls. Imagining this playful episode full of global imagery is actually a way to emblematize poetically the consolation and the escape that imagination offers queer children. And I remembered my own queer childhood and how it was the same. How I played, I was free, roaming around in my head, in my imagination, trying to sort of escape my circumstances in the present. So that is nice and can be built on, I think, as a concept in poem after poem of how queer element is actually all about the imagination itself being the way out, right, for queer children, or queers in general. But again, just some discipline, I think, and a moderation of the surface aesthetics, and now and then to give us some depth. Sorry, now and then to commit yourself to the moment, rather than let the moment slip in this sonic sort of movement, right? And take us again to the next image, which is so unrelated. Why don't we actually sort of dwell in the moment and see where it takes us, Eggless now, we let our nests cry. That was so lovely. Letting your nests cry because they have no eggs, right? Just the whole wonderful way it's said, That happens again and again, Mariel. Kaya talagang moments of breathtaking beauty and then the lapse happens. And then you're lost, right? Okay, Richie.
I've been smiling all throughout this because everything that they felt, like the lostness and the surface, is actually what I appreciate about this entire collection, which contributes to it being more live than just the lived moment on the page. I really, really appreciate this suite of poems. Maybe later I would like to ask if, because I don't know if the organizers were the ones who actually said that this was a suite, or is it a sequence? Like, what is the intention of the writer? Is this arranged a certain way? Is this the end? I want to know what the intention is. I think that this is very queer. I don't demand it to be deep, in a sense that we have always been asked to be deep in that way, diba? In the traditional or conventional sense of being deep.
I like the way that the text dissipates. As for the grammar, parang I'm on the fence with the grammar kasi the entire grammar it can queer kasi like you're subverting it, the entire language, like you might be doing something with it, but it can also be a grammar problem, diba? So I want to know the intention of the writer here, like were you trying to do something with the English? If you really want to do something with the English, do it, I don't know, there's a thin line, really, na parang the thin line that it will work as some kind of subversive act, and then that thin line can fall into just errors in grammar, right? I like the fact that because there are so many layers in the poem, and parang people are looking for a center and they can find, I like that there is none, diba? But in itself, it resonates this. Parang there is a, I don't ask for these things. I don't know, I love that it moves from, I love that it cannot be caught, diba? I love that, that what we are getting is actually parang, it's not only an escape, but escape, diba? Like a scene, parang a world delivered line per line. And there's something very, I don't know if it's your background, but something zoological, botanical, there is that kind of,
trilobites, cochlea.
yeah, diba? Ang sarap, diba? Of course, this polar bear is here, and then parang may pagka, echo poetry happening, and I see the queerness. Usually kasi, diba, you like listening to poems or reading poems na may panghahawakan kang linya, diba? That you can quote, put on Tumblr or whatever. And the fact that you can't hold on to anything like that, that it escapes holding that kind of is great, diba? I don't know, am I making sense? Because I'm really on the opposite side of this conversation here. It's I love what is happening here. I love my question lang talaga is the title of the suite, Where Islands Pretend to Drown, which is a very, very interesting title. I don't know.
It's nowhere in this.
Yeah. Sige, sabihin natin that the poems are islands. Let's just say. Where is the pretense?
The playing.
Yeah. And then where is the drowning? Is it the drowning in the language? Ganyan. So, diba? And what is the pretense? And then when you see pretend kasi, what is it performing? What is it pretending? Is there a counterpart poem to that? Parang are we not seeing the other side of it? Diba? I like that, for example, the poem that you read, Kundiman on a Text Message in the Sky Before Seizure. It's like, parang kamura-mura siya di ba? Kundiman on a text message in the sky before seizure. The entire challenge of that title, and all in small caps, di ba? Bakit tayo pumupunta dyan? Bakit kundiman on a text message in the sky before seizure? Are we to apprehend this as some kind of a love song, unrequited love, whatever. So parang there's that layer of that, di ba? Then you have the entire OFW layer. Then you have the layer of the tension of the couplets that she is breaking from sexing, rebars, instead as palm wine, penis, hostage, mother, skirt, or church bells, or electricity, shimmer, reminding him, di ba? There's that, it's broken into couplets, and then parang the fragments are coherent. There's not a single sentence here na like the couplet is sealed in one sentence. Every single sentence is broken. So I also want to ask about that. What I like about when I read poetry as a reader, and if I have more questions about why the poem is, I'm more interested in reading it. Diba? That, it's not really about code breaking, but I think that's amazing. There is no whole sentence here in the couplet. And what is that about? Is it because it is a text message? Diba? Parang I haven't really counted the lines. Yung text message, but di ba there was a time na parang, how many characters lang? 60, diba? I haven't counted, diba? It would be interesting though, diba? If you could actually count it and then there are 60 characters or something, and that would make sense that this kind of poem is actually giving us a time frame as well, diba? Pero I don't think so. Looking at it now, I don't know. Diba? Pero it's a QWERTY alphabet of a blushing Nokia.
It's still the
So it's
keypad.
1990s?
Keypad pa siya.
Kasi meron pa rin mga
No smartphone.
You would know. Yeah, you would know. Sige, all that. So parang there's time that's happening here. And I think it's wonderful. Parang it's the poems explode eh. They give off this, parang they're bombs of atmosphere that I really appreciate. Diba? Ano ba yung favorite line ko dito? Dahil romantic lang ako, it's sorry. And that's it. When you look at it, may mga personal bias ka talaga. Diba? There are certain lines that you like. But then when you like them, you go, bakit? Kasi, yun lang eh. Diba? Parang they do resonate.
So I think that the title "Islands Pretend to Drown" immediately we're thinking of our archipelago, made up of islands,
Yeah.
and which of course we've been ravaged by natural disasters, and some of them have involved drowning. And so there is that sort of poetic sort of dimension to it. And Kundiman is the nationalist poem here. I mean, the nation poem in a way. It summarizes the story of our sort of generation of so many Filipinos leaving the country to work overseas, right? And leaving behind, and yet when they leave, they bring home with them. Actually, they remember home. Like this moment of stream consciousness, someone is on a construction site, and instead of like sexing rebars would be these steel, huge steel pieces. That's not what happens. So he has a seizure of memory, and it's a stream of consciousness. It basically goes back home, And it's not even like linear kasi hindi naman immediate past, and na-recall na yung kanyang circumcision, which must have happened in the remote past, right? So, it's talking about poverty, the reason why Filipinos leave, because there's no job, gainful employment in the country. There's that. So there is social commentary in the collection, right? And that's my guide actually when I read it. I could see it in poem after poem, the poem about molestation by priests, okay? The poem about the poor ocean scavenger, right? The strange thing about that is I'm not too sure, Mariel, what happens. What is an antlered body that ascends and bursts suddenly? Because I see him walking into the bay shallows, right? And starts plucking out sea urchins and things to eat. I suppose he's poor, he's a scavenger. And then from afar he sees an antlered body bursting. Thinking, deer? Suddenly bursting out? What could that be?
Kapag nanunulog po kasi ako, pag yung moon. Tapos may time na bitawan mo kasi yung gas lang. So parang yung shadow mo, biglang gaganon sa side. So yun pa yung ni-refer ko sana na parang yung shadow mo slowly pupunta siya sa horizon and then
So it's, okay, right there the problem is how to capture that without transfiguring it too metaphorically that the literal is lost. And in yesterday's sort of little sort of introduction, I did say that both the real and the true have to be on the text, in the text. The real is the experience. It has to be clear. And then from there, you have truth being intuited, you know. So without the real, we can't even get to the truth yet. So that happens again and again, right? I mean, you think about this flight towards, this escape towards playful imagining. What necessitated it? What prompted it? That's not clear. Right? That's the question I have, Richie. I understand, I love it too, in the sense that it's so untrammeled, and it's so carefree and doesn't care really about whether it's understood or not, which is very queer. Keber, di ba? Walang pakialam. Pero, you understand, compelling yung kinikwento niya eh, at meron siyang commentary. Mawawala yun pag hindi clear yung real. So we want the real clear. No limitahan niya clear for me. Very clear. Except for the last last segment, last vignette, which goes back, I think, to the husband and wife, right? Because I don't see the shift to the visual being sort of explained or made inevitable yet. The weirdest poem is the aviary one. I completely don't understand. Lost. I think it has a Paulo Coelho thing in it. Okay. But lost. I find Defense probably the strongest piece in terms of just looking for consistency and narrative sort of line, clear in Defense. Let's hear from the others. Sam Steno. No, that's Steno. The mic.
Hi Mariel, what I like about your poetry suite is that while reading it, I immediately know that the writer is a very skilled poet because your vocabulary is superb, the imagery is vibrant, the movement is dynamic, parang almost every line something new is happening. Actually, share ko lang, when I received the email, the workshop kit from Sir Francis, pag-open ko, then the first poetry from you. Sabi ko, shit.
Everyone was said the same thing.
And then napatingin yung office mate ko, sabi niya, bakit? Tapos pinakita ko sa kanya yung monitor ko, sabi, tignan mo, basahin mo. My friend is a creative writing major, also in UP. Sabi niya, oo nga, no? Masabi ko, ang dami mas magaling. Nilamon yung mga tula ko, sabi ko sa kanya. And then, but I guess the difficulty, the challenge that I had when I read your work was not a reflection of your lack of skills to connect with the readers, but I guess it's a reflection of my ineptness in reading poetry. So parang, sabi nga ng kaibigan ko, yun yung parang feeling mo ang bobo-bobo mo. Pero alam mo naman na nakakaintindi ka ng English. So I guess it's a reflection of me lacking this the experience of reading such kind of poetry, because this is not the kind of poetry that you will give to someone that you want to introduce poetry. It's not lang-lib, di ba? But kasi parang it's really difficult to read, it's very challenging. So I guess it's a humbling experience kasi nung pinabasa ko siya, it felt like I was injecting steroid to my brain. Parang lumalaki yung cerebellum, hypothalamus, parang binabasa ko siya. Which I last felt when I was doing trigonometry nung high school pa. So ang hirap. But at the same time, it's a humbling experience because I realized na ang dami-dami ko pang kakainin bigas. Not just in terms of writing poems, but also in reading poems such as this one. So yeah. And thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Yes. We can play, say, fellows muna. Let's exhaust everyone. Yeah.
Hi, Mariel. Unang kong nag-capture sa akin sa poetry suite na to ay yung title ng buong collection, Where Islands Pretend to Drown. Kasi I figured, pa sa context ng 5 words na to, that these islands are pretty old in a sense na naka-emerge na sila from the ocean. And since it says here they pretend to drown, it's as if these islands are imagining their own downfall. Dahil parang over time, ang sea levels nag-rise dahil global warming. So yun. And also, from someone who was initially influenced in writing because of songwriters, I always look for the musicality of a poem. And I find na yung voice ng lahat ng tula sa collection to ay isang rapper. In a sense na parang all these pieces don't want to sit still. They're all very potent in their own way. Parang in almost every line, there's a sense of wordplay that wants to tickle my tongue. Kapag sinasabi ko, when I speak, when I say these poems out loud, however difficult, and admittedly, ito yung last collection na binasa ko kasi hirap talaga. The challenge, I think, sa gantong length ng pagsusulat is finding the restraint. Kasi in the beginning is pretty strong. Somehow, sometimes it gets lost in the middle. And yung restraint ay ma-realize na lang kapag malapit na sa dulo. So parang the last few lines, we're gonna look back to all the lines that have been written for one piece. And I think dun sa part na parang in a sense medyo maximal siya kasi you see in this entire collection, all the poems here na this writer has a love for words. However, in transitioning sa bawat image na pinapresent, it somehow confuses the reader, and so the reader gets lost in the poem. And siguro yung baka sabi ko kanina, doon lang sa padulo na sasabi, or naiintindihan yung context ng book.
Yeah, tama yung sinabi niya, hirap basahin ito. Pero at the same time, parang superficial pero actually malalim. Kasi parang yung writer nagsusulat siya, nanaginip pero gising. Diba? Nanaginip na gising. Lakas ng imagination kasi especially yung sa tuli, parang na-imagine niya yung isang character na lahat na-imagine niya yung sensation. Birin niyo pati yung breeze, walking hairs in his eyes like iron fight. Yun yung bagong tuli, di ba usually yung lalaki. Susot ng palda. And yung sensation na yun,
Parang alam niya.
okay, hindi mo
Ano po pag may mga
hindi mo nadaanan yun, hindi mo ma-imagine, pero siya, na-imagine niya. So, palagay ko yun yung strength talaga ng director. Para Nano ako, super impressed. Tapos at the same time, aware siya sa kubo. Hindi lang yung body ng isang character sa community, kundi pati yung buong experience ng community, parang dala-dala niya doon sa kalooban niya, pati yung mga jeep, lahat. Hindi lang zoological, hindi lang botanical, but everyday things na nabubuhay, parang wow, pang klase siya mag-isip. So, super, galing.
Mabilis ditong na observasyon sa koleksyon. Hanga ako sa Makata dahil sa kanyang pagpapakitang gilas sa gamit ng wika at ng mga imahen. Lamang, masyadong malapot, masyadong, sa Tagalog, matawag. Dense, yun, matawag, dense. Minsan hinahanap ko na, nasaan na ba yung diwa, yung insight ng tula? Na parang, ang ganda-ganda ng ng mga imahen. Pero ako pinagdudahan ko yung sarili ko na, ba't di ko nakukuha yung insight ng tula nito? Pero tingin ko, hindi naman talaga yung proyekto, no, ng Makatang ito. Gusto ko rin ito mabasa sa mga estudyante ko, no, dahil ito yung klase ng mga tula na pinapakita mo rin kung ano ba ang iyong mga napag-aralan. No? Mariel, tingin ko mahilig ka manood ng BBC Docu. No? At pareho tayo. No? Kaya sa ganung aspekto, no? Nagustuhan ko yung paggamit mo ng siyensya, no? ng natural science, no? Na ipakita mo rin ang iyong erudisyon, no, sa pagsulat. At yun naman talaga yung kahilingan bilang isang makata, no, yung erudisyon, hindi lamang sa iyong personal na karanasan, kundi sa maraming pagkaalaman, particular na science. No? Kaya gusto ko, ginuhitan ko yung mga imahe mo rito ng mga halaman, no, ng mga nilalang ng dagat, pati itong isang isda, no, yung prehistoric fish, na talagang search ko sa Wikipedia, no, Lazarus taxon. Nakakala mo extinct na yung pala, nag-exist pa pala, no, sa ibang mga dagat.
But those supposedly predicts earthquakes. When you find oarfish being inserted beach, right?
Oarfish ba yun? Di ba yung yan?
Sunfish.
Oarfish, it's the oarfish, the very long fish.
Okay. Pagdating sa language naman, no, napansin ko 2 pesos yung ginamit yung panig. No? Kaya bakit panig? Tapos yung iba, shrimp paste, pati mo ginawang bagoong. No? Para magkaroon ng local, Filipino-ness. Pati oarfish, pati mo ginawang local name. So, bakit panig? So, yun ang tanong ko rin sa'yo, no? Na parang hindi ka consistent, no, sa paggamit mo ng mga local o mga termino yun. May tanong din ako sa page 70, no? Isang linya dito. Long hairs began to age.
Isa, puto.
Pero yung hair hindi naman kumakatid, iba yung
Ganun na, inexact.
So,
There's a part of the aesthetic is inexactness and imprecision. You can see it happening a lot. This tangential lang lagi siya. Which can be okay, but can't be the whole thing. That's what I'm saying. It's too much an embarrassment of riches, like a wonderful modernist sort of gesture that cannot be the point of the whole thing, but simply should be just used sparingly.
So muli, napaghanga, no, sa Makatang ito, napaka-mature, no, bilang isang Makata. Nung bata ako, hindi ako ganito.
Oo nga.
Nung bata ako, hindi ako ganito. Napakanipis ng mga tula ko. Ikaw napaka-ano, no?
Mga haiku-haiku lang tayo.
Mga
Oo, ang dami-dami.
Mga love lost, mga ganito.
Sapin-sapin.
Yung kwento ni Ronald, di ba? Mga ganun lang. I was dumped, mga ganun. Ayan. Okay, after John, can we play Shane Carrion's video? Yes.
Okay, coming from my discipline as an MFA, creative writing graduate of De La Salle University, and I'm afraid it's a very formalistic one. So when I got a copy of the collection, and let's say when I read the first poem, sabi ko, what is this? No, parang, nasaan yung organic unity? No, so I'm looking forward to all these things. No, so,
Hindi ka naman pinanawa ng bagit.
Hindi naman. Except that, sabi ko, ba't ganito yung poem? No? I can read English. No? Sometimes I write in English, but hindi ko siya maintindihan. So, sabi sisihin ko agad yung text, hindi ako. No? So, automatic yun. And I'm thinking, no, because this is the first LGBTQ workshop, I think, so sabi ko, I think there's a need for me to rethink my idea of what a creative writing workshop is, no? Because my experience in creative workshop, it's very formalist, no? And here, I think we should look for the sort of LGBTQ aesthetics, no? So, because diba, normally when we read a literary text, a poem, we look at the form and content, no? So, and that's why I'm happy, no, that Narisa na wala. No, I'm so happy with the text, no, kasi parang, ito yung binibigay ng collection, no, ni Mariel, no, na baka doon patungo, no, sa what is a gay poetics, no, kung meron man, no. And then, ang comfort ko lang is, no, I look at the title of the poem and the collection, kasi yun yung guide, no? Parang, well, almost a habit na, no? That when you look at the title, yun na yung mag-guide sa'yo in reading, no? The poem, no? And I also noticed nga, sabi ko ba't walang ano dito, no? Kabaklaan dito, or LGBT dito, no? And it's, may pagka-eco-criticism siya, eco-critical yung collection, no? Which, I'm thinking, yun naman talaga ang ano, no? I think, ang mga tao lang na pwede mo in-concern sa Earth, no? Are ano, no, women and LGBTQ, no? Because the norm, the hetero norm is that wala naman talaga concern sa Earth, no? So inaapi lahat, no? Sa so doon siya tinignan, no? So parang it's maybe it's an emerging consciousness, no, of LGBTQ writing, no? So
well, we don't reproduce so much, so we're helping the Earth.
Yeah, that's one thing, no? So and then I cannot really help myself, pero tumutok pa rin ako sa mga individual words, no? So, or phrases, no? Like, so sa title nung ano, nung kundiman, no? Text message in the sky. Yung text message na mahaba nung pula, no? So, and then, yung favorite ko, kasi ito lang maintindihan ko, no? Yung The Ocean Scavenger, no? Kasi very, very clear yung narrative, no? So, may isang lalaki, no? Namumulot siya ng shell, so, di ba yun na, very simple narrative. Pero naisip ko, paano tayo magkaroon to kung bigyan natin ng gay perspective, no? So, what if, no, mga what if lang namin ito, gawin kayang, bakit yung ano, yung ano dito, scavenger, mag-isa lang siya, no? Mukhang walang pamilya, no? So, pwede siguro magandang bakla, no, na nag-iisa, kaya kailangan ng mag-gather, no?
Pobre.
Pobreng bakla, no? Kasi sa bansa natin, no, kawawa ka na kung bakla ka, lalo na kung bakla ka walang pera, no? Mas doble kawawa. So, parang yan. And then, what if the scavenger is also a woman, no? Woman, no? So, bakit lalaki ang pinili na scavenger dito, no? And, of course, may anyway, most vital question is, bakit scavenger? Kasi hindi naman basura pinupulot niya, no? In fact, these are gems from the sea, no, that are edible, no? So, scavenger kasi parang assumption parang basura pinupulot. Pero hindi naman, no? In fact, yung tao, ito yung scavenger, siya lumulot talaga siya ng graces from the sea. So,
ironic lang.
Ironic siguro, pero mas maganda kung mas positive yung ano, yung perspective. And then, yun, nahanga ako, no, sa lashness, no, yung malapot, no, yung tula. And then, of course, kailangan ko mag-google ng mga salita, no? And as a scholar of ng literature, tuwa ako sa Qatar na salita, no? Kasi nilugay ko siya, oh my God, kaya pala binigay nun, may kataro sila ng word for sipon, no? So English pala siya, hindi pala siya Bisaya, no? It's from Qatar. So, yun.
Okay, we will play the video. Thank you so much, John. We'll play the video now. This is Shane. After her video, meron pa rin time, so we can still workshop. Volume. Sound.
But I will be reading from the script, so I won't get too much out of time. I hope you'll have a good start of the workshop. The first suite of poems that I'll be talking about were Islands Pretend to Drown by Mariel Alonzo. I have to admit, it wasn't a very easy read for me. Kind of exhausting. Not exactly in a good way. Mostly because I think it's, shall I say, the aesthetics of these poems differ from the many other things I've encountered, and I appreciate very, very kinds of, or types of poetry. It feels, at least to me, that this collection has too much room for vagueness, incoherence, sometimes unintelligibility, and most of the time, inaccessibility. This may be the author's intention to be part of her project. This too may possibly be of a particular aesthetics of a school of poetry that I'm not very familiar with. I don't know. Although there are certainly on a basic structural level of grammar, we notice misplaced modifiers, missing antecedents, questionable word choices, excessive, thus becoming ineffective adjectives. These raise suspicions on intentional design and, to a certain extent, betrays the sense of being overwhelmed by a deluge of beautiful words, beautiful images, unexpected word combinations. In other words, it gives a sense of lack of artistic control. What I do appreciate in these poems, though, aside from small attempts of alliteration, is the way how it cues thought through words. Never mind, I don't exactly understand much of what the poems are trying to say, except what I can only claim as generally unfounded speculations of what the poems are about. But a skewing of thought, logic, reason, coherence, these we might be able to read as queering perspectives, which I appreciate. In which case I feel, and of course I could be wrong, that this collection, with its quirky images and puzzle-like turns, definitely is a very good beginning for many conversations, especially in the beginning of this workshop. A lot of clarification, even debates from varying aesthetic standpoints, which might make this collection good for poetry studies, a field that has a knack for intensive, close reading, for analysis and argumentation, conjectures. But I don't think we're really writing for poetry studies. Sometimes I think that an excessive use of surprising word combinations, adjectives, beautiful lines are ruse to make readers second guess themselves and for something to pass as a work of art, and I hope this is not the case for this collection. Sometimes I also think that excessiveness is a symptom that the artist is yet to fully clarify for himself, for herself, the intended project and the decisive design of how to render this project. The intended project doesn't have to be always a grand theme, or a long narrative. It could be as simple as, I want to write a poem with the words basketball court in it. But I don't know, I feel like we shouldn't cram together too many random words in one piece, so the piece will not have a sense of gluttony in it or uncontrolled indecisiveness. I always believe that poetry, being art, is conscious design. And yeah, I'm not sure about the effectiveness of the arc of the poem in this collection, if the poems are deliberately arranged in this way, and if so, how? As all the poems in this collection seem to generally ride on the reader's guesswork. The first poem, Playing Passover, feels like a coming of age. It's not exactly coming out, it's coming of age. It implies a seaside setting, menstruation, and possible premarital sex. And I wonder, to cite an example of questionable word choice if the author is aware of the many associations that come with the word Passover. By using this specific word, all these many associations actually come into play in the poem itself. Then there is the male OFW Volder-Liad, the second poem for Diman. And then in this poem, Noted ni Tamheret, I read an implied love triangle, a blind husband, deaf woman, and her priests. And this poem strangely uses the word Fahrenheit, which should be capital F. It signals a specifically North American context. And how does this context come into play with the poem itself? Because the word Fahrenheit is definitely a signal. There's also a man living by the coastline in search for food by the seashore, on the seashore, in the poem, The Ocean Scavenger. And I'm not very sure if scavenger is a right word for it, because to scavenge means to go through the refuse, and these food that it finds, these are not refuse, definitely. There's also a very big poem, possibly in Mourning, by the aviary's brother, Sat Down and Wept, which recalls a popular Coelho text. There's also a possible testimony of a rape victim in the poem, a hunter-gatherer invents clothing. And finally, the last poem, Defense, I find very interesting in a sense that we have this legal speak, whereas, merged in the same sentence as almost the insensible. My first question is why or how did the author Mariel decide on the pronouns of the personas or characters who populate her poems? I understand that, at least in the context of this workshop, the autobiographical sense is brought into the reading or into the conversation of how we make the poems. And so, being a queer writer, and as a queer writer, pronouns do matter. The other questions I suggest the author to think about in revising the poems are, first, what does the poem gain or lose in choosing to keep or to do away with some words or phrases that you love very much, or in choosing to instantly operate the level of metaphor, if not implausibility? Second, do the words in this poem sound smooth together when you read them aloud? Or do they sound clanky or awkward? Third, when you think about these poems, try to ask yourself, what is it that I truly mean to say, and what is the most effective route for the reader from the initial presentation of my idea or experience, for the reader to vicariously experience what I truly need to say. I guess that's all for now.
Wow, she anticipated what we were saying. There seems to be coherence. But she brought up an interesting point about how modernist poetry is interesting for poetry studies, but do we really write for poetry studies? So I think, Mariel, one question that your collection brings up is readership and reception. And is the degree of difficulty worth it in terms of trying to actually get an important message across to as many readers as possible? Since you have justice as a central agenda, I think, in your collection, trying to redress grievance of the oppressed and the suffering in this archipelago where islands pretend to drown, actually are drowning. And that's a ruse, I think, a paradox that you're cultivating. Then is the difficulty the best route, as she said, to take? And then also, the poems don't all end with a clear idea of an insight, which I think it's something still worth asking ourselves, you know. There has to be the truth in the end. The real you capture, yes, and then from the real comes the truth. And the truth is really illumination of the real. It is the real rethought, reconsidered, and embraced, you know, because it is meaningful. So I think we can open the floor again. We have 15 more minutes to other comments. Ponzi. All right.
So, I'd just like to comment on a few aspects of the suite. Like for example, I feel like the writer is very conscious of certain devices, like how the word Passover has many associations, and I felt like it was visible in playing Passover when, on one hand, there was a line that goes, "This heat painted across the bamboo doors to stroke God's eyes away, make the hut invisible," which is a clear biblical reference, but at the same time, Passover is sort of this basketball jargon, and there is an image of the carved out heart of a polar bear still beating Ruby past the dribble, shooting at any halo. To me, I feel like I appreciate the pieces better in fragments than holistically, precisely because there are a lot of standout lines. But I do admit that it felt alienating reading them. As a reader, I felt inadequate. I felt alienated, which I don't think is the point of the pieces, but you know, the unintended consequences. At the same time, for me, why I thought that the writer was it was very decided in the choices was because in A Hunter-Gatherer Invents Clothing, the first line, two words that stood out to me were cat called and wolf whistled, which are very animalistic references. It was consistent. There was a commitment to that imagery with tusks, antlers, exoskeletons, all of this use of those words. If I would add anything na lang, I felt that I would have chosen a different word. You used attorney kasi. There was some form of a trial, but the trial is not exclusive to a courthouse setting. I would have probably used, chieftain or something, just to stick to the rustic, animalistic image. Just to commit to it more. But other than that, yes, I really liked it. If I understood it better, I would probably like it better. That's it.
Okay, hey girl. So what I'm gonna do is just to put more a micro lens of some sort in some of the poems, because I feel like people have already tackled your poems in the general sense of the suite in more articulate terms. For example, in Passover, I actually read it as, to me, it's one of the queerest poems in the suite, because it deals with this burgeoning desire that grows in a rural setting. And my reading of it stems from because of the language that you use. And I highlighted words like suckling between our thighs, lips ultrasound these wounds, bells in her below, imprisoned in each pant, send the sky like a wet dream. So to me, there is some sort of narrative there about discovering desire. And it is forbidden because also in the word choice that is present here, for example, when you stroke God's eyes away and you signifying the act as a sin, there's some sort of forbiddance there, and I related to it in a queer lens, in a very queer lens. Also for this poem, I felt that the object or the spark of the awakening was very defamiliarized to me, because I read it as the heart being the physical and metaphorical object that brought about this narrative. And linguistically, formalistically, you can see that it was hard for me to anchor in it in the following lines, because it's cold blood, a secret smudge by our skirts as we ran to keep it to ourselves, still beating Ruby we passed. there is a point in those stanzas that I have to remember, it's the heart that we're talking about. So, formalistically, because of its denseness, there was a struggle for me to keep on that anchor. But at the same time, I wondered at the image because, and maybe that's part of your intention, because it was so defamiliar to me to use a polar bear's heart as this catalyst. So for Ocean Scavenger, what I really liked about it is it's such a lyrical rendition of a mundane act, and I say mundane because we see this act of labor, we see this routine that this person has to do for survival. So it is of the world, it is of the flesh, and then use this fantastic shimmering language to put it into rendition, into words. But at the same time, I really did feel that there was a force inside at the end. Like, to me, it's just, for me, it could have stood alone without the antlered body, because to me that was too much of a surprise. There was no setup, for example. Because the rest of the poem was just a description. Basically, it didn't try to tell me anything, but it was just a focus on language. And I felt that was the project, maybe, of the poem. But then it felt like, oh, I have to add some insight or something. And then that's why I added the last two stanzas. Yeah. So by the aviary is also a very difficult process. But what I read, I thought I was getting this narrative, and I'm not sure because it got lost in a way. But for example, I read the first one as sort of a feminine body, because the nerves of a cage show us that there's some organic or flesh characteristic of the cage. So I was thinking maybe it's the body. And then this is reinforced by words like hollow bones, incubated shells of nap, soft boiled, scrambling. So there's an ovarian kind of characteristic to it. But again, I got lost because, for example, how does a slat of number teach us about flight? It's like a leap that I can't think yet. Yeah. And then for like a hunter-gatherer, to me it sounded like something that could be spoken word, but like I leave that to the expert. But it did sound to me as more of a spoken word variety of kind of poem. I loved the juxtaposition of, for example, Swift had spit your first makeups, things like that. I think I just had some few problems with it. For example, you wove something from the spine and the vocal cords, for example, which to me does not have a parallel in terms of materiality. And then I love how the flowers is now some sort of metaphor showing that nature is now following this culture that has been oppressed and placed on women, because for example, the Venus flytrap is now a corset, the lily of the valley is now a skirt. So it's like biology taking over this artificial culture that is imposed. But at the same time, again, I think this may be one of my question marks in the suite is like the last. The last is always some sort of like, this is like the epiphany or the insight, but sometimes it doesn't connect to me. For example, all the creatures of the sea are on fire, and fire, as we see in poetic tradition, does mean desire, for example, and based on the project, it does have a lot to do with desire and consent. But at the same time, you attribute that they're on fire is the creatures of the sea. But in the context of the whole poem, what the sea creatures are just the instruments. For example, they are the mussel, and they are the trilobite. They are only the objects of oppression, whereas the oppressors themselves are predatory. So I was wondering, this is my biggest question mark, why are the creatures of the sea on fire when you prescribe the oppressors with a carnivorous rather than aquatic quality?
Thank you so much, Nico. Paolo has something to say, and then
Really short.
Yes, and we have 5 minutes left. We'll, of course, let Mariel answer some of the questions, or all of them. Or just to close it, we'll leave it to the author.
Just the context, no. When I got the collection of poems for the workshop, I was surprised to see may babae. So I was expecting, a lot of, vaginas and a lot of tits and everything. But I was sort of surprised to see it was presented, or she's presenting a different light into. It's very Amish ang dating sa akin ng text. It's very earthy. Medyo pabundok, padagat. But I especially loved the piece called "A Hunter-Gatherer Invents Clothing." I kind of like the imposition that fashion is invented. That clothing, it's very trans, it's very transgender, transvestite to sort of impose that clothing is invented. It's a construct that's sort of feminized, but apparently it's an invention of somebody who has a masculine task, a hunter-gatherer. So, yun lang. I especially love this because it dictates that sort of direction about how clothing really affirms genders and a lot of things in general. So, I guess yun lang for now.
The man invented clothing first, and then the girl mimics, right? And she uses nature to clothe herself, right? And there's a sort of like a scene of patriarchal injustice in the end. The attorney says, "What were you wearing?" Kasi that's normally what if a girl or a woman accuses a man of raping her, that's the question. So it goes back to that early time, Well, it's the men who invented clothing, actually, and to serve their purpose, and then to differentiate genders, and then also to oppress women in the end, right? So, Mariel, can we end now with you reacting to all the things you heard? You have 4 minutes.
So first of all, I'd like to say good morning. And maraming salamat po sa lahat ng mga komento ninyo. I really appreciated you guys reading it very in-depth. One of my fears actually coming here was that perhaps I wouldn't be able to gain new insights because usually the main comment would be that it's inaccessible.
So this is different experience from
yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, very, very, very different actually. Pero nakaka-humble naman din. So, doble humble ngayon. So, again, thank you po for the constructive criticisms as well as for the inspiring messages as well. I guess I'd like to answer na lang the questions that was posed by Ma'am, by Zir. By Shane. By Shane Period po. So, first is she asked about my use of pronouns. So, I guess, tumpak ko yung una sinabi Sir J. Garcia. The stories that I usually tell are the stories that I encounter myself. In order to avoid concerns with regards to ethics, I usually ask for consent if it's okay. And then I ask them to read the poem. Pero I just, tell them what's it about it. They don't read it. So yun siya. It's mostly for me to understand my feelings with regards to these situations. So because sometimes kasi parang kasi I work a lot as a PFA person, so I give psychological first aid. And at a certain point, it gets very taxing. So what I do is that I try to release it and see how do I really feel about these things after being in that position wherein I have to transcend the situation. So I have to be
trauma counseling?
Hindi naman po. There's no trauma yet. So just after a crisis, I'll be there and then talk to these people and yun po. And so yung sa pronouns, they're exact to the situations that I have encountered. Yun siya. At a certain, may times when I use she or he, some poems are about me. So sometimes he ako, sometimes she ako. And yun siya. With regards naman sa I appreciate the idea of excessiveness. So I guess it's something that I really need to work on regarding how effective am I with using all of these different layers or using all of those other devices. So I'll try to moderate it more and be more aware, especially sa aking grammar. So, grammatical errors. So, I think I will definitely do something about that. And what do I really want to say, or ano po ba yung talagang goal ko po for this project is that I've been writing a lot and for a while no, parang nawawalan kasi ako ng parang gana sa pagsusulat kapag wala akong goal. So inisip ko, sana naman makagbuo ko ng kahit isang libro, kahit lang para lang sa pamilya namin, just to keep all of these poems. Kasi I like to write, I keep on writing, and then I write about things or different things. And to a certain point, this was the collection that I submit, for example, natin yung Manila Writers Workshop. They said talaga na parang iba't ibang tao yung gumawa ng mga tula. So I guess this is my first time really trying to have a bigger vision on how these poems could be like one wrap-up collection. And I'm still very infantile with regards to this. So I'm working on it na kaya ng 50 poems ng ganun kahaba na while not being able to alienate the reader or destroy the self-esteem of the readers as well. Parang ang sakit naman nun. Yung ganun. So yun po, thank you so much, and I hope that one day that I'd be a poet that you would keep in your back pockets. Salamat.
So we after this fruitful encounter, we'll have a fruitful lunch. So we'll have a break, we'll see each other again.
What time do we resume
One.
the next
1 p.m.
session? 1. Okay, so we have an hour. Okay, first session.